Ahoy! Today we're talking about additional changes to patch 8.2, the Tiamat release, since Hi-Rez decided to make some changes that will affect, especially Tiamat, quite a lot, that were basically made in post after PTS was down and were now announced. The first one is a change to Death Begets Life. This ability no longer triggers item effects. I don't know for sure what this was referring to, but I'm assuming it might have something to do with Shield of Regrowth, because at the end of the day, there's a good chance that because it's a healing effect, it might have procced that, and if it did, then that's something that it probably wasn't intended to do, because that would mean that Tiamat would get procs very easily and very frequently. The more important change, though, is one we look into in more detail and compare to some other gods in a bit as well, and that's a buff to Primordial Onslaught. So Primordial Onslaught, keep in mind, has 3 different versions essentially. On the 1st and 2nd rank it shoots 2 projectiles, on the 3rd and 4th rank it shoots 4 projectiles, and on the 5th rank it shoots 6 projectiles. So the scaling here was buffed but also changed. Previously it was 60 to 100 with 10 per level, and now it is 80 to 100. But the 1st and 2nd rank, from the 1st rank we have 80, and then on the 2nd rank we have 90. But when you get the first 2 additional projectiles, the damage doesn't actually increase further beyond that, and it stays on 90. Then the next rank puts you on 100. And then on the 5th rank you also don't get any extra base damage again, but rather just extra projectiles. You can see that the last rank here is unchanged, but everything before that is, and that's very important. Primordial Onslaught on its last rank was actually a pretty strong ability if you could confirm most of the projectiles, especially if you build into power. The problem was primarily that it has a longer windup, it is hard to aim, and the power curve essentially is kind of rough, because the ability is very weak for a very long time, then strong for a while, and then late game falls off because the scalings aren't the highest and it works more around base damage most of the time. And that's now completely changed, and that's why I want to look into that in more detail. But let's quickly talk about the rest of the changes here first before we get into those numbers. So there were some fixes as well. You can no longer stack minions at gates basically, and then have them all come out at the same time. They will now despawn if they get stuck. This is for her, primarily for serpents, I think that's what's used. And the same thing applies, or another thing here is also an issue with the serpents, being that Fire Giant and Titan could not attack her, which obviously makes them a little bit stronger against them. So that's fixed as well, which is very good. There's also a change to ranked leavers. In 8.2, if a player leaves a ranked match and the match is surrendered early, only the player who left will lose MMR equal to a normal loss. So it doesn't even seem like there's any extra punishment or anything. It's just that's the only player who will lose anything now. This is only for early surrenders though, so it doesn't seem to have any impact if somebody leaves or disconnects later. Then there are some other fixes that we don't have to go into detail. Alternate Timeline and Warriors X now actually have the stats they were supposed to have, which they didn't beforehand. There was a small fix to Brawling, where it didn't work properly in interaction with things like mana heals. Fafnir had a little bit of his fix with aim. I'm pretty sure this was somewhere else on the patch notes already, but it is again. This one is very important though. Hachiman fixed an issue where Hachiman's ultimate timing changes could affect future uses of relics. So you were basically blocked from using relics after coming out of your ultimate, which led to some very frustrating problems. Bamba's Hammer on the PTS had an internal cooldown, which was really bad and really ruined the item, to be honest. And that was only a dev test and will not go live, fortunately. I think Bamba's Hammer definitely needs balancing of some sort, but the way that it was balanced on the PTS was most certainly not the way to go. And there was also another fix an issue where this might trigger multiple times on certain god abilities. I think this was especially a problem with Merlin, but also some others. I think this applies for Ymocha as well, for example. I think she had the same effect essentially. So that is also fixed. Bamba's Spear has a fix where it was not healing the proper mana percentage, but I'm not sure if it's fully fixed now, because it's also not healing in some other situations where it should be healing. So I don't know if that part is fixed. And the same for Death Embrace as well. Janos gets some teleport fixes where he could just randomly teleport into very different places from where he was aiming to go, which was very, very weird and funny. And fix for Yom, and not being able to move through the gates without opening for short periods of time after finishing his ultimate. And then some other fixes that aren't really important to talk about, because I want to talk about the Tiamat changes. So this is the old Tiamat scaling. Focus on this part first. So we have the 5 ranks here, very simple. We have the base damage of each rank, that's the one you already saw. And then I have done a calculation for the base damage of all hits. So the secondary hits, every hit is reduced by 15%, and the minimum damage that has to be left at the end is 30% of the max damage, and that's how it scales in terms of base damage and scaling. So this is the total damage you do with the first ability on the first rank in terms of base damage alone, if you hit all the projectiles on a target, or more importantly, if you hit them on a wave. And it scales up from 111 to 380. Then we have the scaling value, which obviously doesn't change throughout, but the scaling from all hits, you can see this is because here you have 2 projectiles, 4 projectiles, and then here the 6 projectiles, which overall increases the scaling as well, the same factor that the base damage is increased. I used a build, a very standard 100 gem tier 1 Doom Orb build, along with the red buff, which is what you will have at the start of the game, or will have most of the time in early game, realistically in most games, to see how much power I have. The power here would be 61, and then by the time you reach rank 4, I added Shoes of Focus, which is probably what you usually want to go for now, so that you'd have 121 power. So this should be a relatively realistic outlook of how much damage you will have when playing Tiamat. So these were the old values, right? So we have 150, 169, 314, 410, and 540. You can see that there are also quite interesting jumps here in damage output overall, due to the way that these abilities scale, that this effect works. And that has now been changed quite drastically. Keep in mind, this jump here is from the power increase as well. So this is what it looks like now. Same values, everything else is kind of adjusted around the same level basically. And you can see that the base damage on rank 1 is now 148. That's 166, then it's 279, 310, and 380. The total damage output is what you can see at the bottom here. So we have 187 on rank 1, 206 rank 2, 345 on rank 3, 441 rank 4, and 540 on rank 5. Now, these values are some that I have put up here as well at the top, so that they're pinned, so we can go through some other guards in comparison and see how much damage this really is. Because again, Tiamat's point beforehand was that her early game was weak, and then she ramps up very well and performs very well in late game. And my impression with this change is that they want her to be feeling better in early game specifically, so that people aren't immediately like turned off by how she feels for the first few levels and like, okay, I'm never going to play her again because she feels weak at the start of the game, and I don't like that. Because many players will not enjoy feelings of having to come online with the character first, and will get the impression that the character is weak. And I already said that her real big weak spot is her early game, and everything else I think is pretty potent. And since she didn't receive any other nerfs or anything to offset that, I think this is a very impressive change, and you'll see why. So one ability that I compared that to is a Ra Beam, because that's a very simple clearing ability. And the Ra Beam comes in at 156 damage on rank 1. Now we have to say, of course, Ra Beams are a bit safer. You can place them from a further distance. They don't have a wind up. They don't have to have you stand in the area for a brief moment to fire the projectile. So obviously it's not the same. It's not 100% the same thing. But it is interesting that the first ability, or the first rank of Tiamat's ability, now already deals more damage, which even translates over to clearing the first buff camp or whatever. If you're not playing her in mid, then clearing multiple buff camps as solo especially, or as jungle even if you want to play that. So we have higher damage there. Then on rank 2, Ra actually has 10 extra base damage over Tiamat, but on rank 3, Tiamat already comes out on top again by a lot, because then you get the extra projectiles. And from that point on, Ra cannot keep up in terms of damage output here with Tiamat. It obviously can change later again, because Ra has pretty good scaling on his one as well. And depending on how many projectiles you hit in a fight, there's going to be a major difference. You can typically not expect to hit all projectiles on a moving target. But still, I think for clearing specifically, I would rather have Tiamat scalings here than Ra's. If we look at Morrigan in comparison, we see that she has even less damage. It's actually interesting, and this is factoring in the double damage basically from hitting a minion. It's just not even close to what Tiamat can put out. For reference, always look at the top here, because we're going to scroll down now, and we're going to see some more guards. Ragin is an interesting one, because Ragin actually has a very similar ability to Tiamat, not with the same wind-up, but with the multiple projectiles where he has to stand and wave a little bit. Ragin does less damage on rank 1, 6 less damage, but then does a pretty solid extra amount, 35 extra damage on rank 2. But then on rank 3, again, Tiamat comes out on top, and after that, they're kind of similar for a bit, and then Tiamat does even more damage. So even Ragin with a very strong one does not generally outclear Tiamat with a brief phase in between, I would say, when you get the second rank of the ability. Scylla is a very popular mage at the moment. And for her, I also factored in her passive, where she gets some extra power at the end. I didn't factor it against the red buff, but you'll have to forgive me. I didn't want to go like all in depth just for some minor number changes here. But what you can see here is, again, that Scylla on rank 1 does way less than Tiamat, roughly 30 damage here. And then on rank 2, she does just a little bit more, 3 extra damage. And after that, Tiamat outscales her by a lot. And with Janus, we see a similar picture once again. First rank, he does almost the same damage, much safer, much easier. So we give him that here. And this assumes you hit both portals, by the way. But on rank 2, he actually outdamages her a fair bit. And then afterwards, he can actually keep up with Tiamat better. But he also only really has one major damaging ability to clear a wave. Whereas Tiamat doesn't only use her one to clear a wave if she wants to, she can also use it too. And in later stages, she can also swap stances and use other clearing abilities, which means she will probably get pressure over pretty much any other mid at the moment in the early stages of the game, with a brief hiccup in between around level 3. But even that might just be offset by using her 2 already, which would leave you without an escape. So it's kind of a trade-off, I suppose. But I think it's very interesting how drastically she was buffed here. I was expecting that there might be some changes in this regard, but I didn't think they would be this huge. And it's going to be very interesting how that plays out, because I could see Tiamat doing way more now and being very easy to pick up because of that now, because she can't really get bullied. And I'm going to be interested in seeing how that plays out for her meta as well, because initially, or so far, I would have placed her more as a solo, but now with these damage changes, I could see her being more of a mid laner again as well, because she doesn't struggle with the early clear as much. So yeah, small changes in terms of numbers if you just look at them separately, but a big effect here overall. So let's see how that turns out to actual game statistics. But for now, thank you guys very much for watching. If you're new to the channel, please sub button, maybe the bell. And I hope to see you for the next one soon. ZiSotto out.